Welcome to the SBI Podcast, offering CEOs, sales and marketing leaders ideas to make the number.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. This is Greg Alexander, CEO of SBI, a sales and marketing consulting firm dedicated to helping you make your number. You are listening to the weekly SBI podcast series, and today I have with me Scott Cook. And Scott is the Vice President of Human Resources at Rentokil. Rentokil employs 27,000 people in 60 countries and does 2.3 billion British pounds per year in sales. They are a leader in pest control services, which in today's world, where we are all terrified of pest-borne diseases, Rentokil saves and protects people's lives. Scott has over 25 years of business experience, all in human resources, highlighted by some key leadership positions at outstanding companies such as Cigna and Aramark. Scott, welcome to the show.
Well, okay, I appreciate it.
All right, so today's topic is developing the talent strategy as part of the annual strategic planning process. So, Scott, our listeners today are executives focused on hitting their revenue targets. And when this show airs, it'll be middle of the fall, so to speak, and they'll be in their annual planning process, especially those companies that are on the calendar fiscal year. And as you know, it's almost it's impossible to hit your revenue goals unless you have a great team in place. And since you're 25 years in HR, I thought I could pick your brain on a few ways to build the talent strategy.
No, absolutely.
Okay. So my first question is, who in your organization is responsible for defining the hiring profiles of the sales team?
The easy answer would be to say it's the sales leader, but I think with a lot of the things we'll end up talking about this afternoon, my answer is going to be it's really an integrated approach. If we're talking about dealing at a strategic level, it's not separating out, here's what sales does, here's what operations does, here's what the HR guy does. It's really how do we integrate our business strategy with people. So in defining what success in sales looks like, it's the sales leader sitting down with the HR leader, putting that in the context of what's operations trying to accomplish. So I view it very much as a shared accountability based on the fact that we're business people around the table trying to solve business problems. Okay,
fantastic. So, and again, my slant on this, I appreciate the strategic commentary, and I agree with you. Our slant, given what we do for a living, is always on the sales leader here for this interview. Okay, so you're collaborating with the sales leader, HR and sales, are doing this collectively. When you've gone through this before in the past, and maybe the recent history here, what types of competencies do you find useful when hiring salespeople today?
I think one that I would put at the top is not really a functional or technical competency. It's more the notion of resilience. How can you deal with either resistance? How can you deal with a changing marketplace? How do you deal with perhaps a boss or a leader or a market condition that's constantly changing? Folks that only have one way of operating or only have one playbook that they know, I think have difficulty operating in an environment that's changing where data is coming at them in a lot of different ways at an increased pace. So to me, resilience comes to the top of the list. Whether you state it that way or talk about it in terms of flexibility or the ability to learn or agility, I think those are all things that come to the forefront. I think clearly the ability to communicate well, which is a really broad term, but to me, communication starts with listening first. I call it listening with intent. I'm listening not to just come up with what I'm going to say next, but I'm really listening for meaning and understanding. Because that allows me to then ask intelligent questions if I'm the salesperson. So that communication skill. I think the ability to then help deliver solutions involves a little bit of creativity, a little bit of innovation, and that's where resiliency comes back in. How do you identify barriers or resistance to change and help people work through that? So communication, resilience, influence skills, I think those come to the forefront in addition to your functional and technical kinds of competencies. And maybe it's somewhat of a cynical view, but I think when you're looking for sales folks, one of the key things is having a bit of a thick skin. Because particularly in an organization like ours where it's high transaction sales, you're out talking to a lot of people. And the ability to deal with no and bounce back from that is, I think, a critical skill. I'd be interested in your experience, but for me, a lot of people can sell. The key question is always, will they sell in the face of resistance?
Yeah. So I love the three that you gave us. The one that I would add, which I think is actually kind of what you're talking about, is problem solving. So, you get into a situation, maybe you've seen it for the first time. It's not necessarily have you solved this problem before, but it's what is your approach to solving a problem that you're seeing for the first time? Because one of the things that you said there that is so important is, sometimes sales leaders or sales reps or managers, directors, what have you, they move from one company to the next and they just rely on the old company's playbook. And, it usually doesn't translate very well. Different company, different customers, different product, different competitors, et cetera. And we see that problem all the time. So problem solving / resilience would be the one for me. Where this gets hard, and this would probably be a good lead into my next question is, so we agree on a competency, okay? Now we're interviewing people for a job and testing for something like that, resilience, a problem solving, which is a broad competency. As opposed to looking at somebody's resume and seeing what their percentage of quota is a little bit more difficult. So how do you drive, a competency like that into a interview / selection process?
Again, this is maybe some of my cynicism coming through, but I think typically interview processes are set up as invitations to be lied to, because we're almost talking to people. Tell us what you would do in this circumstance, or tell us all your good stories. So I think it comes down to having people talk in a variety of contexts. I think one is let them get off their chest the story that they want to tell, but then I like to go after what I call contrary evidence. If I'm getting a really strong perspective on someone that, let's pick a skill like being decisive. If somebody's showing me through a series of situations that they're really decisive, I want to see if that skill or competency can be either overdone or overplayed and maybe even be a derailer. So talk to me about a time where this skill of being decisive really worked against you. So sometimes by taking a really balanced view, walking people through things or experiences of what they've actually done, not what they would do, I think is really critical. I found myself early in my career working in career counseling and doing outplacement at a university. And I would go on interviews almost as a plant just to see how folks were dealing with our students. And I found people inviting me to second interviews that I wasn't qualified for. And in one case, I remember even getting a job interview for a job I wasn't qualified for. Because the interviewer was asking questions that just begged for me to read him. So I think it's critical for us as leaders to not take the easy answer, to go in looking really for reasons to say no rather than to say yes. I feel like I'm throwing out quotes. I don't mean to do that.
No, I love them. Keep going.
To me, it's pretty simple. Yeah, to me, it's pretty simple. You guide people through storytelling and then have them do it 2 or 3 times from 2 or 3 different perspectives. And usually in the middle of that, unless you're really pathological, you're not going to bluff your way through an interview like that. I've been working with some of your folks on a key role that we have open, and I know that's a big part of your process, going through not just what's on the resume, but let's go through a competency-based interview. But even competency-based interviews, to me, has to have the balance of what would you do, what have you done, and if the situation were to change, how could you take this approach and not just apply your playbook, but how do you translate this knowledge into a different situation?
Yeah. I love the contrary evidence. I think that's a great soundbite. This is a 30-minute podcast, and we're covering a very big topic here, talent strategy as part of the strategic planning process. So little tips like that are really helpful. All right, so we've talked at a high level here about the sales leader and the HR leader collaborating on the hiring profiles. We talked about different competencies, resiliency, communicating well, which is listening with intent, creativity and innovation. We talked about driving these things into a hiring process and looking for things like contrary evidence. Let's jump ahead here a little bit to designing the compensation system for the sales team. So similar question, is that the responsibility of HR? Is that the responsibility of sales or finance, or is that done collaboratively?
I think for all these things, I'm going to default back to collaboration because we each bring something different to the table. I think for the sales leader, it's to define ultimately what does success look like. For us together, what are some of the skills and behaviors that would lead to success, and then what are the appropriate ways that we can incent that. I think some of the problems we end up running into in sales compensation is that sometimes we're so driven, and many sales folks have grown up in transactional rewards, that sometimes we lose the ability to incent the longer-term behaviors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense.
If every time I have my hand out to get money for something that I've done, I just look for that next reward, as opposed to particularly the higher you go in a sales organization, whether that's larger accounts, more strategic accounts, or more of a leadership role, the kind of behaviors are not short-term behaviors, they're long-term behaviors. So that's the point where it becomes collaborative again, where the HR person or the compensation specialist can bring a variety of structures and say, here's an option. Let's balance the short-term reward versus the long-term reward. And then the sales leader to weigh in with, well, here's what success looks like. Is this rewarding and incenting the right kinds of behaviors to get us to what success looks like?
Mm-hmm. Okay, fantastic. All right, we're going to take a quick break. If you're enjoying this podcast, you might also enjoy SBI TV, our monthly television program. If you're not familiar with that, here's some information on it. You are watching SBI TV. This is a monthly web TV show featuring guests just like you, executives trying to grow their revenues. Each month, you can peek behind the scenes and watch your peers discuss their strategies for how they make their numbers. You are not going to want to miss this. Welcome back, everybody. This is Greg Alexander, CEO of SBI. You're listening to the weekly SBI podcast series. I'm on the line today with Scott Cook, who is the Vice President of HR at Rentokil, and we're talking about building a talent strategy to support the corporate strategy and specifically also the sales strategy as we head into the new year. So how we build talent strategy is part of the annual strategic planning process. So let's jump back into the conversation with Scott. And Scott, my next line of questioning is, we were talking about hiring profiles earlier, various competencies and how we interview against those. One area of contention right now is this belief that you can only have so many independent hiring profiles, that at some point it becomes cumbersome. What's your opinion on that?
I think we can get too, I don't know if cute's the right word, but sometimes we can be our own worst enemy and becoming too complex. I think for our hiring profiles, and I make a distinction here perhaps between at the execution level versus the leadership level. I think it does, where what weaves it together is values. What does the company value, and what is a success profile for any leader or any functional individual in the organization? I think that's the base that ties all these profiles together. And that, to me, is the determinant of success. There's a lot of people that can do a sales role in a variety of organizations. What we need to ferret out is not only can they sell for us and be successful in the way that we define success. We have a lot of competitors in the marketplace. There are 19,000 competitors in the U.S. pest control marketplace. We all go to the market a little bit differently, and what might have someone be successful in one of our competitors may be a detriment to their success here. So I think it's okay to have multiple profiles, but what really ties them together, and to me it comes back to a core set of values, a core set of behaviors that we define as a success profile for what works at Rentokil or for a Rentokil business. Mm-hmm. And then, I tend to start there in my approach. Then in the middle of the selection process involving multiple people, you get into the more technical aspects of the job. Can somebody do the job? and then come back again. Let's confirm that the fit with culture, the fit with values, the fit with what we determine to be success resides there. Yeah. So I think it's okay to have multiple profiles. I think if we get too cute or get too complicated, we get away from the basics. Yeah. Can the folks do the job? Can they do the job in the context that we define as successful?
Yep. Great advice. That allows for multiple hiring profiles because they're unified at the company value level, which I think is fantastic. So now we have this hiring profile or profiles. You got to go out and market these things and attract candidates. So what's working from that perspective these days?
I think the game is changing quite a bit. I've worked in a number of industries, and I've talked with our folks that I define this as probably the third hardest, or one of the top three at least, job markets that I've seen for different ways. One was kind of late 90s, 2000s, where it was kind of the technology boom. Second was in the construction business, kind of post-Katrina, where you couldn't find folks to do good craft labor. And now it involves largely sales, customer service, and folks that will do service jobs. So we've had to change. It's a lot easier when the company holds the cards and the company holds the power. I think in those circumstances, we define processes that are very company-centric. And what we've had to do is, in very intentional ways, create a candidate-centric approach. So when we go out, it's not here's all the things that we want. It's here are all the reasons why you should come ask us some questions because we have opportunities for you. In some cases, that's subtle, but in many cases, it's not. We've had to clear out all of the nonsense in our application and hiring and onboarding process to, again, put the candidate in the center of the universe here and say, in what ways do you want to engage us? So we're engaging people early, even before we have an opening, in greater and greater ways, and saying, hey, would you ever be interested? And if so, in what context would you ever be interested in working for us? Let's get to know you. You get to know a little bit about us. And one of the last questions when I'm doing that type of networking is asking, what's the best way for us to keep in contact with you? So if you're ready to make a change or if we have a need, we can do it on a more mutual basis. I think the old model is, I have a need, I'm a hiring manager, we're going to put together what process whatever we want. And that could drag on for days, weeks, months, and 27 rounds of interviews. I don't think that process necessarily works in a very candidate-centric world. We're working with your folks on a process that takes the best of both of those worlds. And I believe you call that your top grading process. Yep. We found that to be pretty effective. It puts the candidate in the center of the universe because they have to make some decisions about how engaged am I really in this process. And we give them numbers of times or opportunities to opt out and say that this isn't the right opportunity, but we still want to stay engaged with you. Mm-hmm. But by the same token, trying to keep it to a fairly simple process. So we're not placing too many barriers in someone's way from developing a relationship and learning about us while we learn about them. Yep.
So we're in a frothy labor market for sure. Are you seeing wage pressure?
In some jobs and in some skill sets. Since we're talking about sales, I would say yes.
Yeah.
Definitely in the sales world, yes. In some skill sets, some functions, it's not as much. But I think that's starting to come back again.
Yep.
Sales and sales leaders seems to be about one of the hardest areas that we have right now.
Yep. And do you think this is a moment in time, or you think this is going to be kind of the new state of things for a period?
I think we all sit around and say, this is what the new normal looks like. But then 18 months from now, we're going to be sitting and saying, well, no, this is the new normal. So I tend to think of things somewhat cyclically. Things bounce and bounce back. I think right now, because the supply and demand are kind of turned upside down, that's driving more people looking for fewer candidates. So that's going to drive price.
Yep. Okay. So my last question during this segment, and then we'll take a quick break here, is answering the question, what are we going to train to versus hire to? And, we have needs inside of our organizations, and sometimes it's, do we replace this person with the skills that we need, or do we develop this person based on the skills that we need? And it can be a tough decision to make. And it's one that gets often asked, especially when crafting sales strategy for the new year because they're looking across their portfolio of people and they're saying, I've got this number to make. Can I do it with this team? And what comes out of that is some type of development program or programs and some type of recruiting process. So when making that decision, hire to or train to, any words of wisdom there?
It may be oversimplified, but I think you can train to process, you can train to technique, you have to hire to competency. My quick and dirty definition of competency are what are those innate characteristics that set the best apart from the average. And then that gets into some of the characteristics we talked about earlier, issues around emotional intelligence. If somebody has that resilience, has that problem solving, has the communication, is able to understand how the implications of their behavior on other people, you can train them to a lot of different modalities. If somebody doesn't have that, if they always believe that they're the most important person in any conversation, we're not going to fix that at the employment level. We send them to a clinical setting for that.
That's interesting. All right, great answer. Train to process and techniques, hire to competency. Love that. All right, we're going to take another quick short break here. If you have not checked out the SBI magazine, you should. It has articles with executives making their numbers willing to tell you how to do it. So here's some information on the SBI magazine.
Making your number is hard. Your problems are complex. Complex problems need complex solutions. Introducing the SBI magazine. Read in-depth stories written by award-winning journalists about how your peers have overcome their problems to make the numbers. When you need more than a tweet, social post, or blog article, turn to the SBI magazine. Go to salesbenchmarkindex.com to subscribe.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is Greg Alexander of SBI. I'm joined by Scott Cook, who leads HR for Rentokil, and we're talking about the development of sales strategy the development of talent strategy in support of the sales strategy heading into the new year. And Scott, I'm going to pick up our questions where we dropped off just before the break. And my first question in this segment would be, if it is determined that you need to source some new sales employees, especially if you got to do it at scale, dozens, potentially even hundreds. Who does it, and what is the sourcing process?
And here's I've talked quite a bit, or we've talked quite a bit over the previous segments about the need for collaboration and partnership. I think here is where we can split out some of the duties that then come back together in making a good hire. So for me, the recruiter, the sourcer, the kind of specialist in that area is almost like the marketing person. They're going out and trying to create demand and getting a broad population and working them through a funnel. When I was a recruiter back in the day and kind of the folks I try to work with now, I try to have them develop a relationship with the hiring manager, in this case the sales leader, that says, let me understand your business well enough to tell you who you should be interviewing. And then you, as the hiring manager, need to decide who to hire. So the recruiter, the sourcer, deciding, would this make a good company hire? Do they have the basic skills, but do they also share the values and the basic competency set to make it a good company hire? The hiring manager, or the sales leader in this case, needs to decide, is this the right person for this job, in this location, at this time, in this context? So, who's responsible? I think going out and doing the marketing of candidates from a specialist standpoint ends up falling with the recruiter or the sourcer and bringing to the table a qualified population. And then the sales leader ultimately deciding, is this the right person for my context? But just like in most organizations, including ours, we talk about the fact that everybody sells. I really believe everybody needs to recruit. We should always be out scouting talent.
Okay, very good.
So I don't absolve hiring managers from getting out into the marketplace, just like they shouldn't absolve me from getting out and making sure that I'm helping them source leads for commercial or residential business.
Yeah. In the last segment, we were talking about supply and demand being out of balance a little bit here, and it's really a candidates market right now for sales positions. Normally, historically, the benchmark on time to fill for a sales job, especially a transactional sales job, is 45 days, maybe 60 days. We're seeing 90 to 120 days now. Is that what you're seeing?
Absolutely. And I'm glad, because I'm not glad that that's the case. I'm glad that what you're seeing is consistent with my experience.
You're not the only one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so
it'll take the pressure off, but at least there's misery loves company.
Yeah, for sure. And I know that's always a key focus point for people in human resources, and it certainly is for the sales leaders, because they're typically carrying the quota for the to be hired that's sitting on the org chart. So putting the right person in that seat quickly is important. So any thoughts on how to do that better these days? Shrink the time to fill.
Yeah, and this isn't to skirt the question, but we're changing the question a little bit, not just to look at time to fill, but also time to productive. So starting to think about from the first conversation, what would it take to get this person productively working in the marketplace and executing work on our behalf? And I think for us, that's really the goal to gain, because I think supply and demand will ultimately end up fixing some of the time to fill issues. If we have onboarding and training processes that drag out that time to productive, I think that'll continue to work against us.
Yeah.
So in terms of time to fill, it goes back to what I was talking about, creating the talent networks. Trying to develop conversations with people that may not be ready, but finding out in one context, would you like to have a conversation? What does readiness look like for you? Do you know about us? Do we know about you? So that when the time is to our mutual benefit, let's have another conversation.
Yep.
And the days of waiting till the job is open, I think that's human nature. When you always have 100 things to do, if I don't have an open job, I can drop that to the bottom of the list. Just like in a sales context, you need to constantly be sourcing, developing leads, and developing that pipeline. We need to be working towards that in our organizations relative to the recruiting process.
When you say time to productive, what's the formula for that at Rentokil?
To me, that's from the time the offer has been accepted until the time where you're out executing work. And frankly, that's something we're still working towards. So if we have and it's going to be different for each functional area, but if we have a training and onboarding process I'll make up a number, it's 15 weeks. And if I wait 15 weeks for you to be productive, how much money is left on the table? What are those things about getting to know us, about orienting to our environment, to our culture, to the people that you're going to be working with? This relates to employee engagement too. If I can get you to start engaging with us in ways before you even walk through the door as an employee, that's going to speed the time to you being able to put your skilled knowledge into the marketplace. So it's not just cutting down the formal training, it's maybe changing it around a little bit. Are there certain tasks that could have you out in the marketplace executing work or doing something that has value while you're still perhaps learning a bit about the way we do things? So it's mixing into a more blended learning approach some of our traditional training mechanisms. So we're using a lot more online learning. So some of this is still in development, but we're looking for ways to start engaging candidates or new employees before they even start. Let's take the normal onboarding nonsense off the table. Filling out paperwork and reading endless publications. If I can take that and make that electronic signature, don't spend all your time on that. Spend your time here learning about the company, learning a bit about the marketplace if you're coming from a different market or a different type of an industry. And then that way, day 1, day 3, day 10, you're doing things that are a little bit more productive, not just sitting in a learning mode.
Yep. Good advice. All right, we're going to take one more break. When we come back, Scott and I are going to give you an action plan that will let you develop a great talent strategy for the upcoming year. You should check out the SBI blog. It delivers a best practice in under 5 minutes to your mobile device every day. So if you like this type of content, but you want it in shorter form, the blog is for you. So here's some information on the blog.
Each day, you receive hundreds of emails, tons of text messages, countless telephone calls, and sit in too many meetings. How do you find ideas to make the number with all this noise? The SBI blog filters all this nonsense for you and presents only first-rate ideas to make the number. Simplify your life. Subscribe to one blog and read the best content. Go to salesbenchmarkindex.com and subscribe today.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. This is Greg Alexander, CEO of SBI. You're listening to the weekly SBI podcast series. I'm on the line with Scott Cook, who runs HR for Rentokil, and we're talking about developing a talent strategy to help the sales guys develop their sales strategy and make the number in 2016. So, Scott, let's bring this home for the audience. What should our listeners do immediately following this show to develop a great talent strategy for the sales team before January 1st?
I think it's bring as many people to the table as you can from different functional areas so you get a good rounded perspective. We talked a lot about collaboration, and you asked me a series of questions, who should own this? And I keep coming back to it's a collaborative relationship. So get the right people at the table. It starts with what is the model and what differentiates us from other people. Again, not unlike the sales context. It's what's our differentiator in the marketplace. From a talent standpoint, it's no different. So come up with your good profile. Next, what is the marketing strategy for candidates? How are we getting into the marketplace and not just using the same old tried and true channels, the old post and pray notion? If I post the job, people will come. But how do I get different channels moving? The third thing we talked about is really looking at our internal processes and say, is this company-centric or is this candidate-centric? If we can create a candidate-centric process, that increases the likelihood that we're going to be able to bring in the right kind of folks. And then wrapping that all together with an onboarding and engagement plan that starts engaging people from the time that they first have a conversation with us up to the time that they're executing work productively. So I talked about that in terms of onboarding, in terms of orientation, and trying to speed that time to productive. So get the right people at the table. Be really clear about what you want in terms of a model. Go out and define not just traditional, but some non-traditional approaches to sourcing talent, and then develop a good plan to set the hook and get them to productive as quickly as possible. Because I don't know about you, but anytime I've joined a company or gotten into a new role, I find the first couple of weeks somewhat excruciating because you do have an awful lot of energy and you want to get that applied as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
I remember one of my first jobs spending the first couple of weeks just sitting and reading, and that was pretty excruciating. When you're hiring experienced talent, we've got to cut them loose as quickly as possible within the right context, so that they're happy and we're happy as well.
Yeah, I love the advice, and I love the practicality of it and the soundbite nature of it. Post and pray model. That's such a great term, and I'm going to steal that from you. I hope that's okay.
All right. I probably stole it from somebody else.
All right, I'm going to point the audience at two helpful resources. So if you believe that talent and having A players in your sales team is a key determining factor as to whether or not you're going to make the number next year, I want to direct you to SBI's annual research report titled How to Make Your Number in 2016, which just came out. There's an entire chapter dedicated to the topics that Scott and I spoke about today. And there's a series of exercises in there that you can put yourself through, and maybe even sit down with your HR lead and go through it together, back to Scott's collaborative nature of things. And I think it would be very helpful. So if you want a copy of that, go to salesbenchmarkindex.com/2016-report. 2016 are the numbers, 2016-report. The next resource I would point you to is that if you go through this research report and you want to apply it to your business, and maybe you're doing it for the first time, you'd like some help, we've designed a workshop. It's a half-a-day session, and one of our experts can come out and sit down with you and your HR leader and walk you through these exercises and hopefully help you build this world-class talent strategy. So if you're interested in that, go to salesbenchmarkindex.com/2016-workshop. So same URL, just -workshop instead of -report. Scott, on behalf of our audience and everybody in my firm, I want to thank you for giving us your time and discussing openly your perspective on these things. We're all the better for it.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
And I want to thank the audience for tuning in. A big thank you to you guys. We don't do this unless you guys are tuning in, and our listenership has reached the tens of thousands at this point. So appreciate you supporting us, and I hope that these types of conversations are helpful, and best of luck to you as you try to make your number. Take care.
This has been the SBI Podcast. For more information on SBI services, case studies, the SBI team and how we work, or to subscribe to our other offerings, please visit us at salesbenchmarkindex.com.